Picture a woman kneeling on a cold marble floor in the last blue hour before dawn. A single candle beside her, and all around her the wreckage of light. 200 pieces of cut crystal, her mother's crystal, the only warm thing her mother had left behind in a short and gentle life, lay in glittering ruin at her knees, and Eleanor, Duchess of Ashcombe, did not weep over them. She had wept enough in the years behind her to know that tears changed nothing a man had already decided. Instead, she picked up the last unbroken goblet, the one her mother had drunk from on the morning of her own wedding, and she turned it once in the candlelight so that it threw a small, trembling rainbow across the wall, exactly the way it had thrown one across the ceiling of her childhood mornings, and then she set it against the cold hearthstone and pressed down slowly until it, too, gave way beneath her palm. If you have ever loved something so completely that you would rather see it destroyed by your own hand than see it in the wrong hands, then you already understand the woman on that floor, and you already understand why, in the ruin of the last thing she owned, she was beginning at last to smile. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, and if you believe that a quiet woman can undo a powerful man without ever once raising her voice, then subscribe and stay close, because the Duke of Ashcombe is about to learn that lesson in a manner from which his name will not recover. Eleanor swept the fragments into a square of silk with her bare hands, careless of the small bright cuts they left in her palms. And she thought, quite calmly, that a thing shattered on purpose can never again be given away by someone who has no right to it. That was where her freedom began, there on the floor among the broken light. But to understand the dawn, you must first understand the long grey years that led to it, and the marriage that had been arranged the way one arranges the sale of good farmland, and the house that was beautiful and cold and never for a single hour felt like a home. So let us go back, all the way back to a girl in the north who once believed that being good would be enough to be loved. Eleanor had not been born to a coronet, and she never pretended otherwise, though the world around her spent 5 years pretending it for her. Her father was a shipbuilder on the northern coast, a broad and tireless man named Cornelius Vane, who had made a great fortune out of timber and tar and the patient reading of weather, and who spoke to dukes exactly as he spoke to dockhands, which endeared him to neither. He wanted only one thing that his money could not simply buy across a counter, and that was a title for his blood, a coronet to set above the door of the house his own hands had raised. Her mother, Iris, had softened that house with music and with laughter and with small daily kindnesses that cost nothing and were worth everything. And among the few beautiful things she had brought to the marriage was a set of French crystal, given her by a great aunt she barely remembered, that she loved not for its price, but for the way it caught the morning and scattered it. Eleanor grew up watching her mother arrange that crystal on the shelf where the eastern light would strike it first, and she grew up believing, as children of kind mothers do, that the world was fundamentally warm. Then, the winter Eleanor turned 19, a fever came through the town, and it took Iris Vane in 11 days, and it took with her the warmth of that house so completely that Cornelius could not bear to sit in the morning room again. The crystal stayed on the shelf. Eleanor dusted it herself every week, because she would not trust the task to a maid, and it became, without anyone deciding that it should, the whole of what remained of her mother in the world. So when the Duke of Ashcombe came north the following spring, handsome and titled and quietly ruined, looking for a bride whose dowry might shore up a great and crumbling estate, the arrangement very nearly made itself. Her father got his coronet by marriage. The Duke got a fortune, and a wife he found, in his own careless word, sensible. And Eleanor got a great house called Ravenscar, a husband who was perfectly courteous at breakfast and entirely absent by supper, and a slow dawning understanding that she had been purchased, gently and lawfully, like a good beam of timber for a leaking roof. She learned the house the way she had learned everything in her life, thoroughly and without being asked, because idleness frightened her and understanding steadied her. Within a year she knew Ravenscar better than the man whose name it bore. She knew that the roofs leaked over the east wing and that the lead wanted replacing before another winter, and that the steward's accounts did not add, not by pennies but by pounds, if a person troubled to follow them across the seasons. She knew that the tenants were falling behind, not from idleness, but because the great mill had been let to stand silent, and that a silent mill meant idle hands, and idle hands meant unpaid rents, and unpaid rents meant, in time, a dead estate. She knew that the wine cellar was worth more than the stables, and that the Duke understood none of it, and did not wish to. She learned, above all, one bitter lesson early, and kept it close. The single time she had gently corrected a figure at dinner, naming a sum the steward had entered wrongly, the Duke had laughed, a warm, indulgent laugh, and had told the table that his Duchess had a head for sums the way a parrot has a head for sermons, and the table had laughed with him, because they were his guests and could not afford to do otherwise. Eleanor had smiled through it, and had gone up to her room, and had understood the exact dimensions of the space she was permitted to occupy in her own life. From that night she made herself small in the drawing-room, and enormous in the study, where no one ever watched, and she kept the estate alive on paper long after her husband had ceased to care whether it lived at all. There was a tenant family named Harrow, near the eastern edge, that she quietly saved from eviction one hard winter by finding an error in their favour that the steward had overlooked, and the Harrows never forgot it, and neither, though she did not know it yet, did the steward, who had not overlooked the error at all. She told herself in those years that this was a kind of marriage, and that duty was its own quiet reward, and that a woman who kept the books of a great house was not truly invisible, even if no one ever thanked her. She told herself many things she would later be ashamed to have believed, and the crystal sat on the shelf in the morning room, catching the eastern light, and she dusted it with her own hands, and she waited, without knowing she was waiting, for something she could not yet name. The woman's name was Klein, though that was not the name she had been christened with in a parish register Eleanor would one day take great trouble to find, and she came into the county the way a cold front comes, with a brightness along the leading edge of it that fools everyone about what is following behind. She was charming in the manner that costs the giver nothing and takes from the receiver everything, and she understood men of the Duke's particular kind better than they had ever understood themselves. Which is to say, she understood that a vain man wishes above all else to be assured that he is not vain, and that a bored man will mistake flattery for insight every time. She did not want the Duke, precisely, whatever the Duke came to believe. She wanted the things the Duke stood in front of, the ancient name, the great house, the standing in every room in the county, And she had the rare and dangerous patience to take them one small piece at a time, so that no single theft would ever, by itself, look like robbery. It began the way these things always begin, with the scent of an unfamiliar perfume on a coat that Eleanor chose not to notice, and an evening in town that ran 3 days long with an explanation too smooth to be true. And then it moved, as such things always move in the end, away from the man and toward his money. Eleanor, who read every ledger in the house because no one else troubled to, saw the money moving before she let herself see the woman. She saw sums leaving the estate accounts for destinations that carried no name, small at the first and then not small at all. And she saw the steward, that smooth and careful man Josiah Grade, set his signature beneath them with a hand that never once trembled. She said nothing. She copied everything. She had begun, without yet confessing the reason even to herself, to keep a second set of books, plain and clear, and in the wide margins of those books she wrote the dates and the names and the amounts in her small even hand, and she told herself she was only being careful, the way she was careful about all things. But careful is the word a person uses when she is not yet ready to say afraid, and Eleanor was afraid. Not of losing the Duke, whom she had never in any true sense possessed, but of the thing she could feel gathering at the cold edges of her orderly life, patient and bright and entirely without mercy. Through that year the small thefts became a season of them, and the season became a settled arrangement that the whole county could see, and only Eleanor was expected not to. Klein took a house in town at the estate's expense, though the lease was written so that no single word of it named the Duke. Jewels that had belonged to the Ashcombe family for 4 generations left the house in a locked case and did not return. And when Eleanor asked, quietly, after the sapphire brooch that the dowager had worn at her own wedding, she was told it had gone to be cleaned, and she wrote the date of that lie in her book beside all the others. The Duke, who had never in his life been made to feel the edge of a consequence, grew careless in the way that careless men grow careless, believing that the smoothness of his path was a law of nature rather than the labour of the wife he ignored. He spoke of Klein at his own table, praising her wit, her eye, her taste, glancing at Eleanor as he did it with something that was not quite cruelty, because cruelty would have required him to consider her feelings at all, and it was worse than cruelty. It was indifference, the indifference of a man discarding a glove he has stopped noticing on his own hand. And Eleanor, who had learned long ago not to let her face betray her, sat through those dinners with her hands folded and her expression serene, and beneath the table her mind moved like a clerk's, filing, dating, remembering. There was one afternoon that season when Klein found her alone in the morning room, standing before the shelf of her mother's crystal, and the woman came and stood beside her and looked at the glass with a bright appraising eye and said, softly, so that only Eleanor could hear, that it was a lovely set, and a pity to see it kept by someone who did not know how to be admired for owning it. Eleanor turned and looked at her fully, and understood in that instant the whole of the woman's nature, that she wanted things not to have them, but to take them from someone else. That possession without a defeated owner was, to her, no possession at all. Eleanor said only that her mother had loved the way it caught the light, and Klein smiled, and answered that light was wasted on the dull, and left the room, and Eleanor stood a long while after she had gone, not trembling now, but very cold and very clear, and she took down one goblet and held it up to the window and watched the small rainbow move across her own scarred hand. And she thought that a woman who could look at a dead mother's crystal and see only a thing to be won had told her, without meaning to, exactly how she might one day be beaten. She did not yet have a plan. She had only the growing, terrible clarity that she would need one, and the quiet certainty, hardening in her week by week like frost in the ground, that when the moment came, she would not spend it on tears. The night it finally broke was the night of the great harvest dinner, when 40 of the county's first families sat at the long table at Ravenscar beneath the light of the chandeliers, and the Duke, flushed with wine and with the particular courage of a man surrounded by people who cannot afford to contradict him, called for the good glass to be brought. Eleanor felt the cold move through her before her mind had caught the reason for it. She saw Mrs. Paul, the housekeeper, hesitate in the doorway with a stricken look and glance once helplessly toward her mistress, and then she watched 2 footmen carry in her mother's crystal, every last piece of it, the goblets and the tall wine-glasses and the great cut bowl that Iris Vane had loved above all the rest, and set it down, not before Eleanor, but before the woman named Klein, who sat that night not at the foot of the table where a guest belongs, but near the head of it, in the place that is a wife's place and no one else's. The Duke lifted the great bowl himself in both hands, and he put it into Klein's waiting hands as though it were a posy gathered from a hedgerow, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of that long room, that some things deserved a setting worthy of them, and the county heard him say it. Klein laughed, low and pleased, and turned the bowl slowly in the candlelight in exactly the way Iris Vane used to turn it on bright mornings, and the light broke against the cut facets and scattered across the ceiling in 100 trembling points, her mother's rainbow thrown now for a thief. Eleanor did not cry. She did not gasp. She did not reach across the white cloth, though every muscle in her body strained to do it. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked up at the small trembling lights on the ceiling that her mother had loved, and she understood, all at once and completely, that this was not a broken heart. A broken heart she could have carried in silence for the rest of her life, as she had carried so much already. This was theft, deliberate and public and refined, the last warm thing she owned in the world, handed across her own table to the woman who was already carrying off everything else, and it had been done in front of 40 families, for one reason only, because the Duke was entirely certain that she would sit there and do nothing at all. And so she did, that night, nothing at all, which was the last gift her enemies would ever receive from her underestimation. She let the dinner run to its end. She thanked her guests at the door with a steady voice and a still face, and she watched the carriages go down the dark avenue one by one. And she waited until the house had gone quiet and the woman named Klein had climbed the stairs to a room she had no right to occupy. Then Eleanor took a branch of candles and went down alone to the morning room, and she took her mother's crystal back into her own keeping, piece by piece, cradling each one for a moment in her scarred and steady hands, and she carried it all, in the fold of her skirt, to the cold hearth in her own chamber, and there, in the last blue hour before the dawn, she broke every last piece of it, so that it could never again be lifted by anyone and given to anyone at all. It was not the act of a woman who had lost. Anyone watching, and no one was, would have thought it grief. But it was not grief. It was decision, taking a physical form, the first move of a woman who had at long last resolved to win, and who understood in her bones that the winning would begin with refusing to let her enemies have even the ruin of what they had stolen. When the first grey light came into the room, she was calm in a way that would have frightened the servants far more than any weeping, and she knelt among the bright dust and thought a single clear thought, that a thing shattered by your own choosing can never be taken from you again, and she wrapped one keen shard in silk and set it aside, not for sentiment, but as a promise she was making to herself. By full morning she had already begun, though no one living in that house could have told it from her face, and the first thing she understood was that she must act once, completely, and in such a fashion that she would never afterward need to act again. She had watched other wronged women of the county spend their anger in the small ways, the cutting word delivered at church, the invitation pointedly withheld, the cold shoulder turned in a crowded room, and she had watched every one of those small revenges hand the guilty husband the high ground and the easy pity of society, which loves nothing so much as a wife who makes a scene. An accusation without proof, she knew, was a gift handed directly to a guilty man, for it let him play the wounded party and call her hysterical, and be believed. So she resolved to make no accusation of any kind until her proof was so complete, so patiently assembled, so undeniable, that no gentleman in any drawing-room in England could rise and dismiss it with a wave of his hand. She went first to her own accounts, the second set of books she had kept for 2 full years without ever quite admitting why, and she laid them side by side with the estate's official ledgers on the wide desk in the study, and there, in the margins written in her own small hand, was the whole architecture of the theft laid bare. Sums leaving the estate under Grade's steady signature, sums arriving, when she traced them with great patience through 3 separate banks, into accounts that resolved at last into a single name, and the name was not the christened name Klein used in society, but was, beyond any doubt, the same woman. Then she wrote to her father's old man of business in the north, a dry and scrupulously honest attorney named Mr. Whitfield, who had loved her mother and had disapproved quietly and correctly of the marriage. And she asked him 3 careful questions about marriage settlements and about the precise legal boundary between a wife's fortune and a husband's estate, and about what recourse the law allowed a woman whose settled property had been spent without her consent. When his answer came, 2 weeks later, it was longer by far than any letter he had ever sent her, and it changed the shape of everything, because it told her, in the flat certain language of the law, something the Duke himself plainly did not know, that a great part of what he believed he had been spending had never, in strict law, been his to spend at all. The heart of it lay in the marriage settlement itself, that dry document signed years before by her father and the Duke's lawyers over her head, which had, in the careful phrasing her father had insisted upon and the Duke had never troubled to read, kept a substantial portion of the vain fortune tied in trust to Eleanor alone, and to her heirs, untouchable by the estate for anything but her own benefit. Grade had spent it anyway, quietly, year upon year, on the certain assumption that no one who mattered would ever check, and the Duke had let him, on the same assumption, and Klein had lived upon the proceeds. What Whitfield's letter meant in plain terms was that every pound of it was a debt owed back to her, provable and recoverable, and that the very cleverness of the theft, its patience, and its paper trail had built the case against the thieves brick by careful brick. Eleanor read that letter 3 times over by candlelight, and then she sat for a long while with her hands quite still upon the desk, understanding that she now held the thing she had lacked, not merely grievance, but law. And that grievance a duke may laugh away in a drawing-room, while the law he must answer in a hall of stone. There was a bad week, near the end of that patient season, when she was almost undone before she had begun. Grade came to the study one afternoon on some smooth pretext of accounts, and his eye fell upon the second ledger, where it lay half beneath the estate books, and Eleanor watched his careful gaze rest upon her own small hand in the margin, and felt the whole cold edifice sway. But she had learned long ago to be dull on command, and she laughed lightly and said it was only her household reckoning, the linens and the candles and the servants' wages, figures too small for a man of his importance to trouble over, and she let him see her be exactly the parrot the Duke had named her at that long-ago dinner. Grade smiled, and was reassured and left, and Eleanor sat very still until her hands had stopped their trembling. And then she took the true ledger and every copied paper and carried them that same night to Mrs. Poole's locked drawer, where no steward would ever think to look. Because the great secret of the overlooked is that they can hide anything in plain sight of those who have never once bothered to see them. An honest reckoning is built the way a house is built, by many hands and over time, and Eleanor could not raise hers alone. So she went, quietly, and without appearing to go anywhere at all, among the overlooked people of her own house and county, and she found them ready. She went first to Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper who had stood stricken in the doorway on the night of the dinner, and she found that Mrs. Poole kept a small locked drawer in her sitting-room, and that in that drawer were things she had retained over 30 years of service, without permission, and without ever quite explaining to herself why. There were letters that had been handed to her to burn, and had not been burned. There was a note in the steward's own hand that ought never to have existed. There was a receipt for a case of jewellery directed to the house in town. Mrs. Poole had kept them, she said simply, sitting very upright with her hands folded, because a woman who serves a great house for 30 years learns to keep the small papers that great people are careless about. And because she had watched the Duchess dust her mother's crystal with her own 2 hands, year upon year, and had decided long ago, without needing to be asked, exactly which side of that cold house she stood on. Eleanor went next to a young clerk at the county bank named Ames, a careful, earnest young man whom she had once, years before, spoken up for when his figures had been questioned by his superiors, and she had happened to know that his figures were right. Ames had not forgotten it, the way people who are seldom seen never forget the one person who saw them, and he made discreetly and at some risk to himself private duplicates of the records that told the remainder of the story. And she went, last and most reluctantly of all, to the one person in the world she had never once expected to find standing at her side. The Dowager Duchess, the Duke's own mother, a formidable and unsentimental woman who had shown Eleanor in 5 years not a single hour of warmth. Eleanor laid the whole matter before her plainly, without a tear and without a plea, simply the papers on the table and the truth spoken level, and the Dowager was silent for a very long time, her hard old eyes moving down the columns. Then she said that she had buried her husband and raised her son, and had watched that son grow into a man who let things happen to him rather than a man who made things happen, and that she loved the name of Ashcombe a great deal more than she loved the fool who presently wore it. She chose the name over her son, in so many words, and it was the coldest thing Eleanor had ever heard a mother say aloud, and it was also in that exact moment among the kindest, because it meant that Eleanor was, for the first time since her mother had died, no longer entirely alone in the world. The Dowager did more than lend her cold blessing. She opened a door that Eleanor could never have opened for herself, for she wrote, in her own hard upright hand, to the family's oldest London solicitor, the one man who held the original marriage settlement in his strong room, and who would never have answered a summons from a mere wife. And she instructed him, as the widow of the last duke and the keeper of the family's honour, to send the true document north without delay, and to answer any question the Duchess of Ashcombe should put to him, as though the question came from herself. When that document arrived, sealed and unaltered, it married perfectly to Whitfield's reading of the law, and the case, which had until then been a thing of copies and duplicates and retained scraps, acquired a spine of iron. The two women worked in the evenings after that, in the Dowager's own sitting room with the door locked. The young Duchess and the old one bent together over the papers by lamplight, and it was strange and unlooked for, this late alliance. The warmth that had been withheld for 5 cold years arriving at last, not as tenderness, but as a shared and ruthless purpose. The Dowager had a memory like a ledger of her own, and she recalled dates and visits and small remembered lies that filled the gaps between the papers. The winter Klein had first been seen at the townhouse, the spring the Sapphire had gone to be cleaned and never come home, and each remembered thing Eleanor wrote down and dated and set in its place in the great bound file that was growing on, her desk like a slow and patient indictment. She assembled that file the way her father had once assembled a ship, plank by fitted plank, each paper laid where it would bear the most weight, the ledgers first, then the signatures, then the banks, then the register, then the letters that were never burned, and at the very front the seating card in the Duke's own hand, so that a person turning the pages would be led, without any need of her voice at all, from the small cruelty of a dinner to the great crime beneath it. On the last night before Whitfield came south, she sat alone with the finished file closed under her scarred hands, and she thought of her mother arranging the crystal on the shelf to catch the morning, arranging it carefully so that the light would fall just so. And she understood that she was doing the same thing now with these papers, arranging them so that the truth would fall just so. And that this too was a kind of inheritance from a gentle woman, the patience to set a thing where the light would find it. It was in the middle of that slow and patient work, walking the failing eastern farms one raw spring morning with a bundle of surveys under her arm, that Eleanor met the man who would, without either of them intending any such thing, teach her that she had been valued all her life by precisely the wrong measure. His name, he said, lifting his plain hat, was Thomas Reed, and he was a land agent, a plain-mannered, competent man in an unfashionable brown coat who had been engaged, at the Dowager's quiet suggestion, to survey the drowned and failing farms of the eastern edge. And he treated Eleanor, from the very first hour, not as a duchess to be flattered, nor as a woman to be gently managed and steered, but as the one person on that whole estate who actually understood its accounts, which she was. He asked her opinion plainly about the drainage of the low fields, and then, astonishingly, when she gave it, he acted upon it. He walked the sodden ground beside her and argued with her about ditches and crop rotation and the fair and honest setting of rents, and he lost some of those arguments, and he said so out loud without any wound to his pride, which was a thing Eleanor had never in her life seen a gentleman do. He did not once tell her she had no head for business. He did not once look past her shoulder in search of a man to address instead. Eleanor, who had been starved of exactly this manner of regard for so many years that she had genuinely forgotten it was a thing a person could be given, found herself talking to Thomas Reed across a broken gate the way she had not talked to another living soul since her mother had died, easily and fully and as an equal, and she was careful, because she was a married woman and an honourable one, to let nothing pass between them but respect. Yet respect, freely and gladly given by a person who owes you nothing and wants nothing, is its own quiet kind of love, and both of them came to know it through that long spring, and neither of them said one word of it aloud. There was one morning she carried with her long afterward, when they stood together at the broken gate of the Harrow farm, the family whose eviction she had quietly prevented years before, and Thomas Reed listened to old Harrow explain, with a countryman's slow certainty, why the eastern field flooded every third spring, no matter what any agent from the great house had ever tried. Reed did not dismiss him, as every other gentleman Harrow had ever met would have dismissed him, but crouched in the wet grass and drew the fall of the land with his finger in the mud and asked 3 exact questions. And then he stood and told Eleanor plainly that Harrow was right, and that he himself had been wrong in the survey, and that the ditch must run the other way entire. Eleanor watched the old tenant's weathered face change at being believed by a fine coat, and she understood in that moment that she was watching the precise opposite of her husband, a man whose power lay not in being told he was clever, but in being willing to be told he was mistaken. She thought, and did not say, that if she had married a man like this one, her whole life would have been a different country. She said instead that they had best recut the ditch before the autumn rains, and Reed agreed, and they walked back along the hedgerow in a companionable silence that said more than either of them dared, and the light came slantwise through the May blossom. And for the length of that walk Eleanor was, for the first time in years, simply and quietly happy, and frightened by how much she wanted it. What Eleanor did not know, and would not learn until the day it mattered most of all, was that the plain man in the brown coat was not at all what he appeared to be. That Thomas Reed was a courtesy name and not the whole of the truth, and that the reason he understood great estates so thoroughly, from the soil and the ditch upward, was that he had been born and raised to inherit one far greater than Ashcombe, and had chosen for a season of his own choosing to walk away from the drawing-room and learn the land from the bottom, so that he might discover just once in his life whether a woman could value him for the work of his hands rather than for the coronet that waited at the end of them. The truth of the thing, when at last Eleanor saw the whole of it laid out in a single line, was larger and colder than a mere affair, and it changed the very shape of her anger, cooling it from something that burned into something that could be used. Josiah Grade, the smooth and careful steward, and the woman who called herself Klein, were not 2 separate misfortunes that had chanced to land upon the same unlucky house. They were partners, and had been from the very beginning, before Klein had ever set her bright and studied smile upon the Duke, and the Duke himself was not the architect of Eleanor's ruin at all, but only its most convenient and most useful instrument. A vain and negligent man steered, like a slow and heavy ship toward the rocks, by two people who had studied, with great care, exactly which flatteries would make him turn which way. The affair had been engineered deliberately to keep the Duke abroad and distracted and pleased with himself, while Grade quietly bled the accounts, and Klein moved the plunder beyond any easy reach, and even the crystal, that public and exquisitely cruel gift at the harvest dinner, had not in truth been the Duke's own idea at all, but Klein's, offered to him as a charming whim, and intended as a test, a probe to discover whether the quiet and much underestimated Duchess would finally break, and make the very scene that would discredit her forever before she could ever grow into a threat. Eleanor understood then, sitting alone in the study with the whole architecture of it clear before her, that she had been underestimated so completely and for so long that her own enemies had learned to use her dignity itself as a weapon against her. And she understood in the same breath that this was the precise thing that would undo them in the end, because a woman whom no one troubles to watch can gather every proof in the world at her leisure, unhurried and unsuspected. She stopped, from that hour, thinking of the Duke as her chief enemy. He was, she saw now with a cold clarity, merely the largest and most expensive fool in a room full of thieves, and a fool is not to be punished in the same coin as a thief. She began, instead, to sort the guilt before her by its true degree, exactly as a magistrate would sort it. And she began to prepare not a scene at all, but a case. They forced her hand before she was entirely ready, as the guilty so often do the moment they feel the solid ground begin to shift beneath them. And the escalation, when it came, was brutal and swift, and meant to end the matter in a single stroke. A document was laid upon Eleanor's own desk one grey morning by a stranger who would not give his name, and it was a formal challenge to her marriage settlement, a lawyer's attempt to have her original fortune declared long since absorbed into the general estate and therefore forever beyond her reach. And behind that first blow came others, worse and more cruel. There were forged leases, drawn and signed, that would have turned 3 tenant families, the Harrows among them, off land their people had farmed for 100 years and more. And there was a quiet, poisonous letter, unsigned, suggesting to certain persons of influence that the Duchess of Ashcombe had grown nervous and strange in her mind of late, over-fond of figures and ledgers unbecoming to her station, and that she might perhaps be more comfortable and cause less awkwardness if she were gently retired to a distant house in the country where she need trouble herself with nothing at all. It was the move of a long game laid down like a final and confident card upon the table, and it was designed to frighten her into silence, or better yet, into flight. Instead, it gave her the one thing she had until then lacked, which was a date and an arena. For a case such as the one she had so patiently built does not win itself in a drawing-room, where a duke's careless word will always and forever outweigh a duchess's careful one. And Eleanor had understood from the very first that the reckoning must fall where the humiliation had fallen, in the full and unavoidable light of the public, before many witnesses, with the evidence read aloud in a voice all could hear, so that afterward no man alive could pretend that he had never heard it. The county assizes were to sit in 3 weeks' time, The magistrates would hear the matter of the forged leases and the bled accounts, for those were crimes against the law and not merely cruelties against a wife. And the very same 40 families who had sat and watched her mother's crystal handed across the table to another woman would be gathered again in that hall to watch what came of it. She wrote to Mr. Whitfield to come south with all his papers. She wrote to Ames to bring his careful duplicates. She unlocked, with Mrs. Poole's blessing, the small drawer of retained letters. And into the front of the great bound file she had made of it all, she folded the one thing she had kept whole and undamaged from that terrible night, which was not crystal, for she had broken every last piece of the crystal but the harvest dinner's seating card, written out in the Duke's own unmistakable hand, with the woman called Klein set down plainly in the place of a wife, dated, and beyond any power on earth to deny. The hall at the assizes was filled to its bare stone walls on the morning the affairs of the Ashcombe estate came to be heard, and the Duke walked into it wearing the easy confidence of a man who has never once in his life been made to answer for anything, entirely certain, even then, that the ancient weight of his name would settle the whole business before it had properly begun. He did not understand, even as he took his seat, that the quiet had been planning all along. He did not understand it when Mr. Whitfield rose, a dry, spare figure with spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, and began, in the flat and patient voice of a man who has waited a very long time to be proven right, to lay the matter out piece by careful piece. He set the estate's official ledgers beside Eleanor's true ledgers, and the room saw the two columns diverge. He set the divergent sums beside the steward's signatures, and the room saw whose hand had signed. He set the signatures beside the bank records, and set the bank records beside the single resolved name, and each fact was laid upon the last so plainly and so slowly that the great hall passed from its opening murmur into silence, and from silence into that particular deeper stillness that comes over a crowd of people who were all, at the very same moment, recalculating everything they had thought they knew about a man they had dined with for 20 years. Ames, the bank clerk, stood and confirmed the records in a steady voice. Mrs. Poole rose in her best cap and produced, one by one, the letters that were never burned. And when Grade attempted to bluster, his smooth voice cracking for the first time, and when Klein attempted to weep prettily into a lace handkerchief, the papers upon the table simply went on being true, which is the one great thing that honest papers do that guilty people cannot argue against. Whitfield pressed Grade upon a single lease, gently, the way a surgeon presses upon the place that hurts, asking only whether the steward would confirm that the signature upon it was his own. And Grade, who could not deny his own hand before a hall that had seen it upon 100 honest documents, said that it was. And then Whitfield laid beside it the date. And beside the date the record from Ames showing the true owner of that land had been 3 counties distant and aibed with a fever on the day the lease was supposedly agreed, and the hall drew its breath as one. Klein he did not press at all, which was itself a kind of cruelty, for she had prepared her tears for an attack that never came. And a weeping woman with no one accusing her is merely a woman weeping, and the room, which had been half in love with her charm for 2 seasons, watched her and slowly understood, and the understanding was worse for her than any accusation could have been. A magistrate asked her, almost kindly, to state her true and christened name for the record, and she gave the false one, and Whitfield produced the parish register, and the small silence that followed was the sound of the last door in the county closing against her. It was then, and only then, when the papers had done all that papers could do, that the court asked the Duchess of Ascham whether she wished to speak, and Eleanor rose, and she did not raise her voice, and the whole crowded hall leaned in toward her precisely because she did not. She said that she had been called dull and loyal, as though those two words were small and settled things, and that she had been counted upon by everyone to suspect nothing at all. She said that she had, in plain fact, suspected everything, and had written every part of it down, and that she stood before them now not to be pitied but to be believed. She said that she bore the Duke no hatred, for hatred is only another form of attention, and he had earned none of hers. She looked at him then, once, plainly and without heat, across the whole width of that watching-room, and she said the single line the county would repeat for a generation afterward, that he had not been there to be told, and that a man who is never present in his own house cannot afterward claim that he was deceived within it. Then she sat down and folded her scarred hands in her lap, and let the law do the rest of the work she had prepared for it. Justice, when it came at last, came measured out by the exact degree of the guilt, precisely as she had built it to be measured. Josiah Grade, who had forged the leases and bled the accounts and sent a stranger to serve papers upon a lady in her own house, was a criminal in the plainest meaning of the word, and the law took him as it takes such men, tried and convicted and sentenced to transportation beyond the sea, his smooth and steady hand stilled forever, his name so thoroughly ruined that no house in England would ever again trust him with the keeping of a single account. The woman who had called herself Klein, who had always been far too clever to set her own signature beneath the things that hang a person, escaped the reach of the law. But she did not escape the reach of its consequence, for the entire architecture of her long scheme had rested upon standing, upon being received, upon the willingness of good houses to open their doors to her, and standing was the one and only thing that, once the county had seen her plainly for what she was, she could no longer purchase at any price. She decamped, as such women always do, first to Bath, and then to a wealthier and more foolish prospect somewhere abroad, and she ended, by every account that ever drifted back north on the gossip of travellers, exactly as friendless as her own cold logic had always promised she would be. A woman who had wanted men for the having and never for the keeping, and who was, in the final reckoning of her life, kept and cherished by no one at all. And the Duke. The Duke was not transported, for being a vain and negligent fool is not, in England, a crime, and he was not ruined in his purse, for Eleanor took back from him not one penny more than what had always, in law and in justice, been her own. He was ruined instead in the only country a vain man truly inhabits, which is the regard of the room, the good opinion of the people among whom he had always so effortlessly moved. He stood in that hall, and he understood at last, too late and completely and forever, the full measure of what he had thrown carelessly away, which was not a fortune and not a great house, but a woman who had kept his entire world alive on paper with her own two hands through years in which he had done nothing but laugh at her across a dinner-table, and to his small and belated credit, he did then the one honest thing that remained within his power, which was to rise, unbidden, and to say aloud before the whole assembled county that the fault had been his, the whole of it, that he had been a man who let things happen to him and to those he ought to have protected, and that he asked for no forgiveness whatever, because he had plainly earned none. It was the truest sentence the man had ever spoken in his life. Eleanor received it exactly as one receives a late and useless apology from a person from whom one no longer requires a single thing, with a small grave nod of the head and nothing more, and no softening of her eyes. She did not take him back. Forgiveness, she had learned in the cold years, is not at all the same thing as return. He kept up a quiet penance for the remainder of his days, restoring the tenant cottages with his own much diminished funds, because it was, as he said to anyone who would listen, the one useful thing left within his power. And Eleanor allowed it, because honest labour is good for an idle man, but she never once crossed the county to watch him at it. And Eleanor was given, in the end, the ending that quiet and dutiful women are so very seldom written into, the ending that does not depend in any part upon being chosen by anyone. She took back her fortune, whole, and she took the failing eastern farms as her own portion of the settlement, the drowned and stubborn land that everyone else had given up on, and she made it thrive. Within 3 seasons, the low fields she had walked and argued over with Thomas Reed were running green and heavy, the ditches he had cut on her stubborn advice carrying the water away at last, and the great mill that had stood idle and silent for years was humming again from dawn to dusk, giving honest, paid work to the very families who had so nearly lost their homes and their history to a forged lease. And Thomas Reed, the plain man in the unfashionable brown coat, came to her one evening late in that 3rd summer, when the last of the accounts were finally closed and balanced, and the last bright dust of the crystal had long since been swept from the floor of her memory. And he told her, quietly, standing, turning his hat in his hands like the land agent he had pretended to be, his whole name, the one he had kept folded away in a drawer exactly the way Mrs. Poole had kept the letters that were never burned. And it was a great name indeed, greater by far than Ashcombe, an old earldom and an inheritance he had walked deliberately away from for a season precisely so that he might, once in his life, be loved for the work of his hands and not for the coronet that waited patiently at the end of them. He asked her nothing at all that first evening, nothing of the heart. Only whether she believed the north field would take a second cutting before the frost, and Eleanor laughed, a real and helpless laugh, the first in more years than she could easily count, and told him that it certainly would, and that he ought to know as much himself by now, and that was the true beginning of the only marriage that either of them ever afterward counted as one. It was a warm and unfashionable wedding when at last it came, held not among the 41st families of the county, but among the tenants and the mill-workers and the harrows in their Sunday best, with Mrs. Poole in a new cap weeping openly at the front, and Ames the bank clerk grinning from the back of the little church, and the Dowager Duchess, who had chosen the name over her own son, sat in the very first pew and wept as well, which not one living soul had ever before seen her do. Years afterward, when Eleanor's own children asked her, in the way that children always do, about the small square of silk she kept in a drawer of her writing desk and would never give away nor throw upon the fire, she would unfold it for them, there in the eastern light, and show them the one thing she had chosen to save from that terrible night, which was not a whole goblet, for she had broken every goblet with her own hand on purpose, but a single keen shard of her mother's crystal kept deliberately, sharp and bright and wholly hers. and she would tell them, plainly and without ever once softening it, the whole of what she had learned upon that cold marble floor in the last blue hour before the dawn, which was the entire moral of her life, and she never dressed it up for them. That a thing you truly love is safest of all in your own 2 hands. That a woman's worth was never, not for 1 single hour, in the being chosen. And that the quietest person in any room is very often the only one in it who has troubled to keep the books. She had shattered her mother's crystal so that it might never again be given away by a careless hand to an undeserving one. And in the very doing of it, without yet knowing it that morning, she had shattered every last hold the world had ever had upon her. And she had built, patiently and out of ledgers and loyalty and the fierce, quiet devotion of the overlooked, a life that no man on earth could ever again lift up and hand carelessly to someone else. That is where her freedom ended. Which is only another way of saying that it never ended at all, and if her story has stayed with you, tell me in the comments what you would have done with the last piece of your mother's crystal. And remember, always, that the quietest woman in the room is the one you should never make the mistake of underestimating.